The town of Maplewood didn't know what to do with itself on the day Eleanor Blackwood died. The sky itself seemed to mourn, gray clouds hanging low over the coastal cliffs as news spread from house to house, shop to shop, like a somber wave washing over the community. "Did you hear about Eleanor?" they whispered to each other. "Gone at 78. Eleanor wasn't just another resident of their small town. She was Maplewood in many ways. Her family had lived there for generations, their name carved into the cornerstone of the town hall, the library, and most notably the Blackwood Children's Home, which had given shelter to orphaned and abandoned children for over 30 years. The morning after her passing, the local paper ran a front-page tribute. "A light extinguished," read the headline with a photo of Eleanor from just last spring, cutting the ribbon at the new wing of the children's home. In the picture, her silver hair was pulled back in her trademark bun, her smile gentle but commanding. Even in her late 70s, Eleanor had stood straight-backed and dignified, though those closest to her knew about the pain that had begun to plague her in recent months. She wouldn't see a specialist. Her daughter Catherine told the neighbors who brought casseroles and condolence cards to the Blackwood Manor. Mom always said doctors were for other people, said she just needed her herbs and teas. Catherine, at 52, was her mother's echo in many ways. The same deep-set eyes, the same habit of tilting her head when listening intently to someone speak. But where Eleanor had been all cool confidence, Catherine had always seemed to hold herself back, as if waiting for permission to fully exist. The manor felt strange with Eleanor gone. For 3 days after her death, people trickled in and out, bringing food nobody ate, sharing stories about how Eleanor had touched their lives. The mayor spoke of her generous donations to rebuild the town pier after the storm of '98. The principal recalled how she'd personally funded college scholarships for Maplewood High graduates. A middle-aged man who introduced himself only as Thomas stood awkwardly in the grand entryway and told Catherine how Eleanor had paid for his mother's cancer treatments 30 years ago. "I never forgot," he said, eyes downcast. She didn't even know us, just heard about Mom's situation at church and stepped in. On the 4th day, Eleanor's son, Michael, arrived from overseas. He hadn't been back to Maplewood in 15 years, not since the fight that had sent him storming out of the manor, vowing never to return while his mother lived. Yet here he was, tall and weathered, with new lines around his eyes and a European cut to his suit that made him look like a stranger. "Kathy," he said when his sister opened the door, using the nickname she'd outgrown decades ago. His hug was brief, perfunctory. "The old lady finally did it, huh?" "Mom died, Michael." Catherine corrected, her voice tight. "She didn't do anything." The night before the funeral, Catherine found Michael in their mother's study, rifling through the drawers of the antique desk where Eleanor had managed her finances and charitable work. "What are you looking for?" Catherine asked from the doorway. Michael didn't startle or look guilty. He simply glanced up with the cool detachment that had always reminded Catherine of their father. "Just getting a sense of things. The estate, the accounts. There's going to be a lot to sort through." "She's not even buried yet," Catherine said. Michael shrugged. Never too early to be practical. The funeral was held at St. Andrew's Church, where Eleanor had attended services every Sunday for as long as anyone could remember. By 9 in the morning, the parking lot was full, and cars lined the winding road leading up to the white steepled building. Inside, the pews filled quickly with townspeople in their best dark clothes, dabbing at eyes and speaking in hushed tones. The flowers were all white, as Eleanor had specified in her will. White roses, white lilies, white orchids, simple arrangements that spoke to Eleanor's preference for elegance over showiness. The closed mahogany casket sat at the front of the church, gleaming under the lights, topped with a spray of her favorite white peonies from her own garden. Catherine sat in the front row, back straight, eyes forward, her black dress modest and appropriate. Michael sat beside her, checking his watch every few minutes as if he had somewhere more important to be. On Catherine's other side sat Marta, Eleanor's housekeeper of 25 years, who had been more like family than employee. The older woman's eyes were swollen, her hands clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "She shouldn't have gone like this," Marta whispered to Catherine as the minister began to speak. Not like this. Catherine squeezed the woman's hand, assuming she meant that Eleanor deserved a more peaceful end than the painful decline of the past months. Later, she would remember Marta's words and wonder if they held a different meaning altogether. The service was everything. Eleanor would have wanted, dignified, focused on her good works rather than maudlin displays of grief. The children's choir from the Blackwood home sang Amazing Grace, their young voices pure and heartbreaking. Several community leaders spoke about Eleanor's impact on Maplewood, careful to keep their remarks brief as she would have preferred. When it was time for family to speak, Catherine approached the podium, her notes clutched in trembling hands. My mother, she began, then had to pause as her voice caught. My mother lived by a simple philosophy. What we do for ourselves dies with us. What we do for others remains immortal. She looked out at the sea of faces, many openly weeping now. By that measure, my mother has achieved immortality many times over. Michael declined to speak, shaking his head when the minister gestured to him. His expression remained impassive, though Catherine thought she caught a flicker of something. Impatience? Relief? When the service finally concluded. After the church service, a smaller group followed the hearse to Maplewood Cemetery, where generations of Blackwoods were interred in a family mausoleum of pale granite. The structure stood on a small hill, overlooking the sea, its columns and carved angels weathered by decades of salt air and coastal storms. The pallbearers, the mayor, the police chief, the head of the hospital board, and 3 elderly men who had been friends with Eleanor's late husband, carried the casket from the hearse to the mausoleum entrance. Inside, they placed it on a stone bier beside the tomb of Eleanor's husband, who had died 20 years earlier. As the minister said the final prayers, a sudden breeze swept through the open door of the mausoleum, causing the flames of the ceremonial candles to flicker wildly. Several mourners glanced nervously at each other, and even Michael, for all his detachment, seemed momentarily unsettled. Catherine was the last to leave the mausoleum, pausing to lay her hand on her mother's casket, one final time. Goodbye, Mom, she whispered. Rest well. Outside, she found Marta waiting, her face streaked with tears. She was afraid, you know, the housekeeper said, her voice barely audible. Of dying? Catherine asked. I know. That's why she refused to talk about it, even when she got sicker. Marta shook her head slightly but said nothing more as they walked down the hill to join the others. Later that afternoon, as the groundskeeper prepared to seal the mausoleum, he noticed something odd. A scratching sound, faint but distinct, seemed to be coming from inside the casket. He froze, straining to hear in the quiet of the cemetery. There it was again. A light scraping, like fingernails against wood. The groundskeeper, Frank Porter, had worked at Maplewood Cemetery for 32 years. He'd heard all sorts of strange noises, the settling of earth around new graves, the expansion and contraction of wood and metal as temperatures changed, even the scurrying of small animals that sometimes found their way into the mausoleums. This sound was different. It raised the hair on the back of his neck. Just the wood settling, he told himself firmly. Nothing more than that. He hurried through the rest of his tasks, securing the heavy door of the mausoleum and trying to ignore the way his hands shook as he turned the ancient iron key in the lock. As he walked back to his truck, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something important had been overlooked. By the next morning, he had convinced himself it had been his imagination, triggered by exhaustion and too many old cemetery stories. He didn't mention it to anyone, not even his wife. Some things were better left unsaid, especially in a small town where rumors could take root and grow like invasive vines, choking out the truth. At the Blackwood Manor, Catherine sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by enough food to feed the town for a week. Casseroles, pies, bread. The counters were covered with the community's edible expressions of sympathy. Michael had already left for a meeting with their mother's lawyer, eager to discuss the will and the distribution of assets. Catherine sipped her cooling tea and tried to make sense of the hollow feeling in her chest. She had expected grief, of course, but this was something different. an uneasiness she couldn't name, a sense that something remained unfinished. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Marta calling to check on her. "I'm coming by later," the housekeeper said, her accent thicker than usual, as it always was when she was upset. "There are things we should talk about. Things about your mother." "What things?" Catherine asked, but Marta had already hung up. Outside, the clouds that had hung over Maplewood since Eleanor's death finally broke, releasing a gentle rain that pattered against the windows. In the cemetery on the hill, water ran in rivulets down the granite walls of the Blackwood mausoleum, while inside, in the new darkness, something waited to be discovered. A truth that would soon shake the town to its foundations and forever change how they remembered the woman they thought they knew so well. A week passed since they laid Eleanor Blackwood to rest. The rain that had started on the day of her funeral continued off and on, leaving Maplewood draped in a misty shroud that seemed fitting for a town in mourning. The flowers left at the cemetery had begun to wilt, their petals scattered by the wind across the wet grass. Frank Porter, the cemetery caretaker, made his usual rounds on Thursday morning, checking for fallen branches and tidying up around the newer graves. When he reached the Blackwood mausoleum on the hill, he paused, key in hand, suddenly reluctant to enter. Since the day of the funeral, he'd avoided going inside, sending his assistant instead when flowers needed to be placed or candles replaced. But today his assistant had called in sick, and the fresh arrangement from Catherine sat in a basket in Frank's golf cart waiting to be placed beside her mother's casket. "Don't be ridiculous," Frank muttered to himself as he unlocked the heavy iron door. 32 years on this job and now you're getting spooked?" The door swung open with a low creak. Frank stepped inside, the temperature dropping noticeably as he entered the cool stone chamber. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass window above the entrance, casting colored patterns across the floor and walls. He busied himself arranging the fresh flowers, removing the old ones, and wiping dust from the plaques that marked each tomb. All the while he kept his ears open, waiting to hear the scratching sound that had disturbed him a week earlier. Nothing. Just the distant call of seagulls and the soft patter of dripping water somewhere in the old structure. Frank was almost disappointed. Part of him had wanted confirmation that he hadn't imagined it, that there had been something strange about Eleanor Blackwood's casket on the day of her burial. He shook his head, chuckling at his own foolishness, and turned to leave. That's when he heard it. Not scratching this time, but something even more unsettling. A whisper so faint he might have missed it if the mausoleum hadn't been so quiet. Words he couldn't quite make out, spoken in what sounded like a woman's voice. Frank froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "Is someone there?" Silence answered him. He waited, barely breathing, straining to hear. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, seeming to emanate from the direction of Eleanor's casket. Frank couldn't understand the words, but the voice had an urgent quality that made his skin crawl. He backed toward the door, unwilling to turn his back on the room. Just the wind, he told himself as he stepped outside. Just the wind through the old stones. But there was no wind that day, only the still, heavy air that comes after rain. Frank locked the mausoleum door with shaking hands and hurried down the hill to his office, where he poured himself a generous measure of the whiskey he kept in his desk drawer. For especially cold days, he downed it in one swallow, welcoming the burn. By mid-afternoon, he had nearly convinced himself that stress and lack of sleep had caused him to hear things. He resolved not to mention it to anyone. In a town the size of Maplewood, rumors spread like wildfire, and he had no desire to be known as the old fool who claimed to hear ghosts in the cemetery. But then Doris Wilkins came into his office, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Frank," she said without preamble, "there's something strange going on at the Blackwood mausoleum." Frank felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Doris was the president of the Maplewood Historical Society and came to the cemetery every Thursday to place flowers on her husband's grave. She was a sensible woman, not given to flights of fancy. "I was up there just now," she said, settling her substantial frame into the chair across from his desk. "Paying my respects to Eleanor, and I swear on my mother's Bible, Frank, I heard a voice coming from inside that mausoleum. A woman's voice. Frank poured her a small whiskey without asking if she wanted one. What did it say? He asked as he handed her the glass. Doris took a sip before answering. I couldn't make out most of it, but one word came through clear as, "Ice your help." Back at the Blackwood Manor, Catherine sat at her mother's desk, trying to make sense of the papers Michael had been sorting through the night before the funeral. Her brother had been meeting with lawyers and bankers all week, coming home late and leaving early, barely speaking to her except to ask for specific documents. He's up to something, Marta said as she brought Catherine a cup of tea. The housekeeper had been coming to the manor daily, despite Catherine's assurances that she didn't need to work during this time. Your brother never cared about your mother's affairs before. Now suddenly he's so interested in her papers? Catherine sighed, rubbing her temples. He's the executor of the will. He has a right to review everything. And where was this right? For 15 years, Marta asked sharply. When your mother needed him? When she was alone after your father died? When she got sick? Before Catherine could respond, the doorbell rang. Marta went to answer it, returning moments later with Doris Wilkins and Frank Porter. I'm sorry to intrude, Doris said, declining Catherine's offer to sit. But something's happening at your mother's tomb, and we thought you should know. Catherine listened in growing disbelief as Frank and Doris described what they had heard at the mausoleum. Under other circumstances, she might have dismissed their stories as the product of overactive imaginations, but there was a certainty in their voices that gave her pause. You think it's my mother? She asked, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Frank shifted uncomfortably. I'm not saying that, Ms. Blackwood. I'm just telling you what I heard. We thought you might want to come up there yourself, Doris added. Hear it with your own ears. Catherine glanced at Marta, who was standing very still, her face an unreadable mask. Will you come with me? She asked the housekeeper. Marta nodded slowly. I need to speak with you anyway. About your mother. We can go to the cemetery first. The four of them drove up to Maplewood Cemetery in Frank's truck, no one speaking as they wound their way up the coastal road. The afternoon was giving way to evening, the sky darkening with new rain clouds. At the mausoleum, Frank unlocked the door and stepped aside, allowing Catherine to enter first. The stone chamber felt colder than the air outside, and Catherine pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she approached her mother's casket. Mom? She said softly, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. Are you here? Silence greeted her words. Catherine looked back at the others standing hesitantly in the doorway. I don't hear anything. Just wait, Doris whispered. It comes and goes. They stood quietly for several minutes, the only sound the occasional drip of water from somewhere, in the old structure. Catherine was about to suggest they leave when she felt it, a sudden drop in temperature around her, as if she'd stepped into a freezer. And then the whisper came, so close to her ear that she gasped and spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind her. But there was no one there, just the empty space between her and her mother's casket. The whisper came again, and this time Catherine could make out words. Not dead, buried. Help me. Her knees buckled, and Frank rushed forward to catch her before she hit the stone floor. You heard it? He asked, his face ashen. Catherine nodded, unable to speak, her eyes fixed on her mother's casket. We need to get the authorities involved, Doris said firmly. Something isn't right here. Back outside, rain had begun to fall. Again, fat drops that quickly soaked through their clothes as they hurried to Frank's truck. Catherine pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. Who are you calling? Marta asked, sliding into the seat beside her. Michael. He needs to know about this. And then the police. But Michael, when she reached him at the lawyer's office, was dismissive. Ghost stories, Kathy? Really? I expected better from you. It's not a ghost story, Catherine insisted. There's something wrong with Mom's tomb. 3 people besides me have heard these voices. 3 superstitious old people from a town that still believes in sea witches. And harbor curses, Michael scoffed. Listen to yourself. I'm going to call Chief Dawson, Catherine said. Ask him to investigate. And tell him what? That Mama is talking from beyond the grave? He'll think you've lost your mind with grief. I know what I heard, Michael. Her brother's voice turned cold. Leave it alone, Catherine. Mom is dead, buried. It's time to move on. He hung up before she could respond. Catherine stared at her phone, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with her rain-soaked clothes. There had been something in Michael's tone, not disbelief, but fear, as if he wasn't surprised by what she'd told him. That evening, Catherine sat with Marta in the kitchen of the Blackwood Manor, both of them wrapped in blankets and sipping hot tea laced with brandy. They had called the police after all, but as Michael had predicted, Chief Dawson had been skeptical. He promised to send an officer to check the mausoleum for signs of vandalism or trespassers who might be playing a cruel prank, but Catherine could tell he didn't believe her story about the whispers. Marta, Catherine said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. You wanted to tell me something about my mother. Before all this happened at the cemetery, the housekeeper's eyes, usually warm, looked troubled in the soft kitchen light. Yes, something I found the day after she died. Something I should have shown you right away, but I was afraid. Afraid? Of what? Marta took a deep breath. Your mother kept a journal. She hid it in a space behind the loose brick in her bedroom fireplace. I found it when I was cleaning. A journal? Why would she hide it? Because of what's in it. Marta reached into her large handbag and pulled out a leather-bound book, its edges worn with handling. You need to read this, Catherine. And then we need to get your mother out of that tomb, before it's too late. As Catherine took the journal, from Marta's outstretched hand, thunder rumbled in the distance and the lights in the kitchen flickered once, twice, before steadying again. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like fingers begging to be let in. Catherine's hands trembled as she opened her mother's journal. The leather cover was soft with age and use, the pages filled with Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, elegant but practical, just like the woman herself. Marta sat across from her at the kitchen table, watching with worried eyes as Catherine began to read. The first entries were mundane, notes about charity board meetings, reminders to call the gardener about the rose bushes, thoughts on birthday, gifts for the children at the Blackwood home. Normal reflections from a woman managing a busy life of philanthropy and community involvement. But as Catherine turned the pages, the tone of the entries began to shift. Dated 3 months before, Eleanor's death, an entry caught her eye. April 15th. Felt strange again today. Dizzy spells getting worse. Dr. Winter says it's just age and suggests more rest, but something doesn't feel right. It's not like normal fatigue. It's as if something is draining me from the inside out. Catherine looked up at Marta. Mom was sick longer than she let on. The housekeeper nodded. She didn't want to worry you, said it was just a touch of anemia. Catherine returned to the journal, skimming forward through the pages. The entries grew more concerning. May 2nd. Found another bruise today. No memory of bumping into anything. That makes 5 this week, and the metallic taste in my mouth won't go away, no matter how many mints I suck on. May 10th. Hair coming out in clumps now. Had to cancel lunch with the hospital board. Told them I had a cold. Michael called from Paris. Asked about my health in a strange way, as if he already knew I was unwell. First time he's called in months. May 18th. Marta made my favorite soup. Today, but couldn't eat it. Everything tastes wrong. The new pills Dr. Winters prescribed make me sleep for hours, but I wake feeling worse than before. My thoughts are getting foggy, too. Had to ask Marta the same question 3 times this morning. She's worried. So am I. As Catherine read on, a chill crept up her spine. The entries became more paranoid, more frightened. June 7th. Something is very wrong. I found my tea tasted odd this morning and poured it into a potted plant when Marta wasn't looking. The plant was dead by afternoon. Am I imagining things? Is someone putting something in my food? June 12th. Switched doctors. New tests ordered. Dr. Palmer seemed shocked at my symptoms. Asked if I work with chemicals or metals. I don't, of course. June 15th. Test results back. High levels of arsenic in my system. Dr. Palmer says it could be from well water or old pipes, but our water was tested just last year. I haven't told anyone yet. Not even Marta. Need to think. Catherine gasped, her eyes flying to Marta's face. Arsenic? Mom was being poisoned? Marta's eyes filled with tears. Keep reading, she whispered. There's more. The journal entries grew more erratic, some just a few words jotted down, others covering pages with rambling thoughts. Eleanor had begun to suspect someone was deliberately poisoning her but couldn't determine who or how. Then came an entry that made Catherine's blood run cold. July 3rd. It's Michael. Has to be. He came to visit unexpectedly yesterday. First time in 15 years he's set foot in this house. Brought me tea in bed this morning. I pretended to drink it, then tested it with the kit Dr. Palmer gave me. Positive for arsenic. My own son is trying to kill me. But why now, after all this time? Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. No, she whispered. That can't be right. Your mother was very sure, Marta said quietly. She showed me the test. The tea turned the paper bright blue. Poison, plain as day. Catherine forced herself to keep reading. The next entries documented Eleanor's attempts to gather evidence against Michael without letting him know she suspected him. She'd started keeping samples of everything she ate or drank when he was around, labeling them carefully and hiding them in a locked box in her closet. July 20th. Michael says he's extending his visit. Claims he wants to reconnect after all these years. Meanwhile, I grow weaker. Have to use a cane now. My hair is coming out in handfuls. I've told everyone it's cancer, that I'm refusing treatment. Easier than explaining the truth. Who would believe me anyway? My successful, charming son trying to poison his mother. It sounds mad even to me. August 5th. Found Michael in my study today going through my papers. Looking for the will, no doubt. He doesn't know I changed it last year. If I die under suspicious circumstances, he gets nothing. Everything goes. To the children's home. I didn't tell him this. Let him think his plan is working. The entries became shorter as Eleanor's health deteriorated. Her handwriting grew shakier, harder to read. But her mind remained sharp, her suspicions hardening into certainty. August 28th. Michael brought a new doctor today. Dr. Chen, specialist, he says. I don't trust him. Refused to be examined alone. Marta stayed with me. Dr. Chen prescribed new medicine. I won't take it. September 4th. Weaker every day. Hard to write now. Michael watching me constantly. Talks about a private hospital. I refuse to go. Would never come back. September 10th. Had the dream again. Being buried alive. My oldest fear. Remember telling Michael when he was small, after reading the Poe story, how the fear never left me. He remembered. Yesterday heard him talking to Dr. Chen about how death can look like deep coma, how people can be mistaken for dead. Why were they discussing this? Catherine looked up from the journal, her face pale. She thought they were going to bury her alive, Marta finished, her voice barely audible. It was her greatest fear. Ever since I've known her, she made me promise that when she died I would make absolutely sure. And did you? Catherine asked, her throat tight. When she died, did you make sure? Marta looked away. They wouldn't let me see her, Michael and that doctor. They said she went in her sleep very peaceful. The funeral home took her away so quickly. By the time I thought to insist, the casket was already sealed. Michael said it was better that way given how she looked at the end. Catherine turned back to the journal with growing dread. The final entries were almost illegible. written with a hand that could barely hold a pen. September 15th. If you're reading this, I may already be gone, or appearing to be gone. Michael and Dr. Chen whisper when they think I'm sleeping. Something about a drug, untraceable, slows heart and breathing to almost nothing. A temporary death, perfect for their plan. September 16th. Too weak to fight. Now, if I'm buried, check the pendant I always wear. The silver oval with the blue stone. It's not just a necklace. Inside is proof. DNA samples, recordings. Everything needed to prove what they've done. Catherine will know what to do. September 17th. One last entry. If I seem to die suddenly, I have been murdered. If I am buried without proper confirmation of death, I will be buried alive. This is my greatest fear, and Michael knows it. This is his revenge. Not just for the money, but for what happened all those years ago. The secret I've kept. God forgive me. The journal ended there. Catherine closed it slowly, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd just read. The pendant, she said after a long silence. The silver oval with the blue stone, was she wearing it when... Marta nodded. Always. Never took it off. She was buried with it. Catherine stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. We need to go to the police, now, with the journal. They won't believe us, Marta said. Not without proof. And the proof is in that pendant, buried with your mother. Then we need to get it, Catherine said, a new determination in her voice. We need to open that tomb. Your brother will fight it, Marta warned. He has friends in the town council and the police department. He's been making connections all week. I don't care, Catherine said. If what Mom wrote is true, if there's even a chance. She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought was too horrible to put into words. Marta reached across the table and took Catherine's hands in hers. There's something else you should know. Something your mother told me years ago but made me swear never to tell anyone, especially Michael. Catherine looked into the older woman's eyes, seeing a mixture of fear and resolve. What is it? It's about why Michael left 15 years ago. Why he hated your mother enough to do this terrible thing. Tell me, Catherine said. Your mother discovered something about Michael. Something he'd done. She covered it up to protect him, but she also made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. She cut him off financially. Threatened to go to the police if he didn't leave the country and stay away. What did he do? Catherine asked. Though part of her didn't want to know. Marta took a deep breath. There was a girl who worked at the children's home, Alexandra. She disappeared one weekend. Police thought she'd run away, but your mother found evidence in Michael's room. The girl's necklace, blood on his clothes that he'd tried to wash out, notes he'd written about her. Catherine felt sick. Are you saying your mother believed he killed that girl? She couldn't prove it enough for the police, but she was convinced. She gave him money to go to Europe, told him never to come back. And he didn't, not until she got sick, and now he's back, Catherine said, the pieces falling into place. Back for revenge and for the money. Yes, Marta said, and if your mother is right, if she was buried alive, then every minute counts, Catherine finished, already reaching for her phone. I'm calling Chief Dawson again, and if he won't help us, I'll find someone who will. We're getting that tomb opened. Tonight. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke in earnest. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed seconds later by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old house. As if in response, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, Catherine could have sworn she heard a whisper, so faint it might have been imagination. Hurry. The storm pounded Maplewood through the night, flooding the coastal road and knocking out power across town. Catherine spent those dark hours making calls to Chief Dawson, to the mayor, to Judge Wilson, who had been a friend of her father's. Most calls went unanswered due to the storm. Those who did pick up were reluctant to help. You can't just open a tomb based on a journal and some strange noises, Catherine, the judge told her gently. There are laws, procedures. Even if I wanted to help, I'd need a court order. That takes time. Time is exactly what we don't have, Catherine argued, but the judge remained firm. He promised to look into it in the morning, which wasn't nearly soon enough. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and bright. Catherine, who hadn't slept at all, stood at her bedroom window watching the sun rise over the distant ocean. Beside her on the bedside table lay her mother's journal, a terrible weight for such a small object. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Frank Porter. Ms. Blackwood, the cemetery caretaker said without preamble. There's someone here you need to talk to, a Dr. Palmer. Says he was your mother's doctor. Catherine felt a surge of hope. Dr. Palmer? From the journal? Put him on, please. There was a rustling sound as the phone changed hands. Then a deep voice with a slight southern accent came on the line. Ms. Blackwood? This is Dr. Robert Palmer. I've been trying to reach you for days, ever since I heard about your mother's passing. Why? Catherine asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Because the circumstances of her death concern me greatly. Your mother was my patient for only a brief time this summer, but what I discovered was troubling. I'm at the cemetery now because I needed to pay my respects, but I think we should talk in person. It's not something I'm comfortable discussing. Over the phone. I'll be right there, Catherine said. Don't leave. She threw on clothes and hurried downstairs to find Marta already in the kitchen making coffee. The housekeeper looked as exhausted as Catherine felt. Dr. Palmer is at the cemetery, Catherine explained quickly. Mom's doctor from the journal, the one who found the arsenic. Marta's eyes widened. I'm coming with you. They drove through town in silence, passing down tree limbs and puddles that reflected the clear morning sky. As they neared the cemetery, Catherine noticed a police car parked by the gates. Chief Dawson must have taken my call seriously after all, she said, feeling a flicker of relief. But as they pulled up beside the police car, Catherine saw it wasn't the chief, but Officer Reynolds, a young policeman who had only been on the force a few years. He was talking to Frank Porter and a tall, thin man with silver hair who Catherine assumed must be Dr. Palmer. Ms. Blackwood, Officer Reynolds greeted her as she approached. I understand you've been trying to reach the chief. About concerns regarding your mother's tomb? There was skepticism in his voice that immediately put Catherine on edge. That's right. And I'd like to know why he hasn't returned my calls. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The chief is busy with storm damage this morning. He asked me to come by and, well, to be honest, to make sure there wasn't any vandalism happening here. Vandalism? Catherine repeated, confused. Your brother called, Officer Reynolds explained. Said you might try to break into the family mausoleum. Said you've been under a lot of stress since your mother's passing. Catherine felt a flash of anger. My brother is trying to stop me from discovering the truth, and the truth is that our mother may have been buried alive. The officer's expression made it clear what he thought of this claim, but before he could respond, Dr. Palmer stepped forward. Perhaps I can shed some light on the situation, he said, extending his hand to Catherine. Dr. Robert Palmer, I was treating your mother shortly before her death. Catherine shook his hand, studying his face. He looked tired and troubled, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. You found arsenic in her system, she said. It's in her journal. Dr. Palmer nodded. Yes, significant levels. When she first came to me, I thought it might be environmental exposure, contaminated well water perhaps. But the levels were too high, and they kept increasing despite my efforts to identify the source. Did she tell you she suspected my brother was poisoning her? She did, Dr. Palmer confirmed. I wasn't sure whether to believe it at first. Paranoia can be a symptom of arsenic poisoning. But then she brought me samples of tea and food that tested positive. And when I met your brother, something about him unsettled me. Officer Reynolds was listening with growing concern. Are you saying Mrs. Blackwood was murdered? I'm saying it's a possibility that should have been investigated, Dr. Palmer said firmly. I advised Eleanor to go to the police, but she refused. Said she wanted more evidence first. The last time I saw her, she told me she was gathering proof. Something about recordings. The pendant, Catherine said. She wrote about it in her journal, said it contained evidence. I remember that pendant, Marta added. She never took it off, said it was a special gift from her mother, but it looked new to me. Frank Porter, who had been listening silently, suddenly spoke up. If she was wearing it when she was buried, there's only one way to get it. All eyes turned to the Blackwood mausoleum visible on its hill overlooking the cemetery. We need to open the tomb, Catherine said. And we need to do it now. Officer Reynolds looked torn. I can't authorize that without orders from the chief or a court order. Then get one, Dr. Palmer said. Because if what I suspect is true, if Eleanor Blackwood was given a drug to mimic death and then buried alive, this is not just murder, it's torture of the cruelest kind. The young officer paled. I'll call the judge, he said, reaching for his radio. But before he could make the call, a sleek black car pulled up to the cemetery gates. Michael stepped out, followed by a man in an expensive suit whom Catherine recognized as Gregory Phelps, the family lawyer. What's going on here? Michael demanded as he strode toward them. Officer Reynolds, I thought you were going to handle this situation. I'm trying to, sir, but there are some concerning allegations. Allegations made by my grief-stricken sister who's clearly not in her right mind. Michael cut in smoothly. Catherine, this has gone far enough. You're upsetting everyone with these wild stories. Catherine stood her ground. They're not stories, Michael. They're Mother's own words. She knew what you were doing to her. She documented everything. Michael's confident expression didn't waver, but Catherine noticed a tightness around his eyes. Catherine has been reading too many mystery novels, he said to Officer Reynolds. Our mother died of cancer. It was diagnosed months ago. That's a lie, Dr. Palmer said, stepping forward. I ran comprehensive tests on Eleanor Blackwood less than 2 months ago. There was no cancer. What there was, however, was arsenic poisoning. Michael's gaze flicked to the doctor, and for just a moment Catherine saw something cold and calculating in her brother's eyes. And you are? The lawyer asked. Dr. Robert Palmer. I was Eleanor Blackwood's physician. Strange, Phelps said. According to our records, Mrs. Blackwood's doctor was Arthur Chen. He signed the death certificate. Dr. Chen was brought in very late, Dr. Palmer countered. After I had already discovered the arsenic poisoning, I find the timing suspicious, to say the least. The lawyer smiled thinly. Well, this is all very dramatic, but I'm afraid it changes nothing. The Blackwood mausoleum cannot be opened without proper authorization, which would require compelling evidence and a court order. We have the journal, Catherine said. Mother's own words describing how she was being poisoned, how she feared being buried alive. The private writings of an elderly woman suffering from paranoid delusions due to her illness, Michael said, dismissively. Hardly compelling evidence. Catherine felt her chances slipping away. She looked at Officer Reynolds, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. There's one more thing, she said desperately. The whispers. People have heard them coming from Mother's tomb. Frank heard them. Doris Wilkins heard them. I heard them myself. Michael laughed, though the sound held no humor. Whispers from a tomb? Now you really do sound unhinged, Kathy. I heard them too, Officer Reynolds said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. Just now, while I was waiting for Ms. Blackwood to arrive, the young officer continued, his face serious. I was standing near the mausoleum and I heard something. A voice. Faint, but clear enough to make out words. What words? Catherine asked, her heart pounding. Officer Reynolds met her gaze steadily. Help me. Please help me. A heavy silence fell over the group. Even Michael seemed momentarily at a loss for words. That settles it, Catherine said firmly. We're opening that tomb now. You have no authority, Phelps began, but Officer Reynolds cut him off. Actually, sir, in cases where there's reasonable suspicion of a person in danger, emergency protocols apply. I'm calling this in as a potential rescue operation. He walked back to his patrol car and radioed for backup, requesting the fire department as well. "You're making a huge mistake," Michael called after him. "My family will sue the department for desecration." But his threats fell on deaf ears. Within half an hour, the cemetery had filled with emergency vehicles. The fire chief brought equipment to open the heavy stone door of the mausoleum, which had been sealed after the funeral. Judge Wilson arrived as well, having been contacted by Officer Reynolds. "This is highly irregular," the judge told Catherine. "But given the circumstances, I'm authorizing the opening of the tomb pending a formal investigation into your mother's death." Michael and his lawyer stood to one side, watching with barely concealed fury as the firefighters positioned their equipment. A small crowd had gathered: cemetery workers, police officers, and a few curious townspeople who had heard something was happening at the Blackwood Mausoleum. Catherine stood with Marta and Dr. Palmer, her heart racing as the firefighters began their work. The sealed entrance to the mausoleum took nearly an hour to open, the stone door finally swinging inward with a low groan that seemed to echo Catherine's dread. The tomb's cool air washed over them, carrying the scent of stone and flowers and something else, something wrong. Several people stepped back, covering their noses. "Wait here," the fire chief told Catherine. "Let us check first." He and two firefighters entered the mausoleum, flashlights cutting through the dimness. Catherine could hear their muffled voices, then a sharp exclamation. "We need to open the casket," one of them called out. "Now!" More firefighters rushed in with tools. Catherine tried to follow but was held back by Officer Reynolds. "Let them work," he said gently. "They know what they're doing." The minutes stretched endlessly as Catherine waited, every muscle tense. Finally, the fire chief emerged, his face grave. "Ms. Blackwood," he said quietly, "you should come in now." Catherine followed him into the mausoleum, Marta and Dr. Palmer close behind. The interior was brightly lit now with portable lights the firefighters had set up. Her mother's casket lay open in the center of the stone chamber. Catherine approached slowly, afraid of what she might see. The fire chief's hand on her arm steadied her. "It's not pleasant," he warned, "but you need to see this." Catherine looked into the casket and felt her world tilt sideways. Her mother lay there in the blue dress they had chosen for her burial, the silver pendant still around her neck. But Eleanor Blackwood's body was not at rest. Her fingers were bloody, her nails torn and broken. The satin lining of the casket lid was scored with deep scratches. "She was alive," Catherine whispered, horror and grief washing over her in equal measure. "She was alive when we buried her." Behind her, she heard Marta begin to sob. Dr. Palmer stepped forward and gently lifted Eleanor's hand. These injuries could only have happened if she regained consciousness inside the casket, he confirmed. She must have awakened and tried to escape. Catherine closed her eyes, unable to bear the image of her mother trapped, fighting for breath in the darkness. When she opened them again, she noticed the pendant still around Eleanor's neck. With trembling fingers, she reached for it. The oval silver locket came away easily in her hand. It was heavier than it looked, with a small, almost invisible seam around the edge. Catherine pressed the tiny catch on the side, and the pendant clicked open. Inside was not a photograph or a lock of hair as one might expect in a locket, but a small memory card and what looked like a tiny recording device. "Evidence," Catherine said, looking up at the police officers who had gathered around, just like she wrote in her journal. As if on cue, raised voices came from outside the mausoleum. Catherine turned to see Michael trying to push past two officers, his face contorted with rage. "This is illegal," he was shouting. "You have no right." Then his eyes fell on the open casket, on Catherine holding the pendant, and all color drained from his face. "Michael Blackwood," Officer Reynolds said formally, stepping forward. "Based on the evidence before us and pending further investigation, I am detaining you on suspicion of the murder of Eleanor Blackwood." As the young officer read Michael his rights, Catherine looked down once more at her mother's body, at the terrible evidence of her final struggle. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I'm so sorry we didn't get here in time. But I promise you this. The truth won't stay buried any longer. The memory card from Eleanor's pendant contained exactly what she had promised. Evidence. Digital files meticulously organized and dated, each one another nail in Michael's coffin. Catherine sat in Chief Dawson's office the following morning, watching as the police chief and the district attorney reviewed the contents on a department laptop. There were audio recordings Eleanor had secretly made of conversations between Michael and Dr. Chen. In one particularly damning clip, they discussed dosages of a drug called tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin that could create a death-like state in the victim. Enough to slow her heart and breathing to undetectable levels, Michael's voice said clearly on the recording, but not enough to kill her outright? Correct, came Dr. Chen's clinical reply. She'll appear dead to standard examination. No pulse, no visible breathing. Body temperature will drop. She'll remain in this state for approximately 24 to 36 hours before regaining consciousness. And by then she'll be, Michael's voice trailed off. Buried, Dr. Chen finished. Yes. The district attorney, Harriet Lund, a stern woman in her 50s, looked up from the laptop. This is premeditated murder of the most horrific kind, she said. He knew exactly what he was doing. Chief Dawson nodded grimly. There's more. The memory card also contains photos Eleanor took of her food and drink after Michael prepared it, showing the discoloration from arsenic. And she kept a separate digital journal with timestamps and photos documenting her symptoms. The woman built a case like a seasoned detective. She knew no one would believe her without proof, Catherine said quietly. Not even me. I thought she was just being stubborn about her health, refusing to see specialists. All that time she was fighting for her life, gathering evidence against her own son. The pendant had contained one more critical piece of evidence. Hair samples Eleanor had collected from her own brush over several months, each dated and sealed in tiny plastic bags. Forensic testing confirmed what her journal had claimed, steadily increasing levels of arsenic. Why didn't she just go to the police? Chief Dawson asked, not for the first time. Catherine shook her head. I think she wanted to handle it herself, at first. Get enough evidence to confront Michael privately, that was her way, keeping family matters within the family. But then things escalated too quickly. She got too sick too fast. And she was afraid, Marta added from where she sat beside Catherine. Afraid that Michael would harm others if she exposed him. Afraid of what people would think of her for raising a son capable of such things. The district attorney closed the laptop with a decisive snap. Well, she's exposed him now. These recordings, combined with the forensic evidence from her body and the coffin, give us more than enough to charge Michael Blackwood with first-degree murder. Michael had been transferred to the county jail the previous evening, still proclaiming his innocence despite the damning evidence. Dr. Chen had disappeared, his office closed, his home empty. An alert had been issued for his arrest. What happens now? Catherine asked. Now we build our case, D.A. Lund said. Your brother will be arraigned tomorrow. Given the severity of the charges and the evidence against him, I expect he'll be held without bail pending trial. Catherine nodded, feeling numb. The last 48 hours had been a blur of horror and grief and revelations too terrible to process all at once. She still couldn't reconcile the brother she'd known with the monster who had condemned their mother to the most terrifying death imaginable. There's one thing I still don't understand, Chief Dawson said, looking at Catherine with sympathy in his eyes. Why did he do it? Was it just for the money? Catherine thought of what Marta had told her about Alexandra, the girl who had disappeared from the children's home 15 years ago, the girl Michael might have killed. It was partly about money, she said slowly. Mother changed her will last year. Michael probably found out somehow. But it was also about revenge. Mother knew something about Michael. Something terrible he'd done years ago. She sent him away to protect him, but also to protect others from him. He never forgave her for that. The chief nodded, not pressing for details. There would be time for those later, during the investigation. For now, he simply said, I'm sorry, Ms. Blackwood, for everything your family has endured. As Catherine and Marta left the police station, they stepped into bright afternoon sunshine that felt at odds with the darkness of the past days. The news of Eleanor Blackwood's true cause of death and her son's arrest had spread through Maplewood like wildfire. People on the street gave Catherine sympathetic looks or quickly averted their eyes, unsure how to react to such a tragedy. "What will you do now?" Marta asked as they walked toward Catherine's car. "Bury my mother properly," Catherine replied. "With dignity this time. And then, I don't know, carry on her work with the children's home, I suppose. It's what she would have wanted." The second funeral for Eleanor Blackwood was a quiet affair, attended only by Catherine, Marta, and a few of Eleanor's closest friends. She was laid to rest not in the Blackwood mausoleum, which Catherine couldn't bear to visit again, but in a peaceful corner of Maplewood Cemetery, beneath a maple tree with a view of the ocean. In the months that followed, Catherine threw herself into managing her mother's charitable foundation and the children's home. Working with Marta and Dr. Palmer, who had become a trusted friend, she established new programs for the children and expanded the home's services to include counseling for those who had experienced trauma. Michael's trial began 6 months after Eleanor's death. Catherine attended every day, sitting quietly in the courtroom as the prosecution presented the overwhelming evidence against her brother. The recordings from Eleanor's pendant were played for the jury, who visibly recoiled at the cold calculation in Michael's voice as he planned their mother's living entombment. The defense tried to argue that Michael had been framed, that Eleanor had manufactured the evidence due to paranoid delusions, but the medical reports, the testimony of Dr. Palmer, and the physical evidence from Eleanor's body and casket told a different story. The arsenic in her system, the tetrodotoxin Dr. Chen had administered, the desperate scratches inside the coffin lid, all painted a picture of deliberate, calculated cruelty that no jury could ignore. On the final day of the trial, just before the jury went into deliberation, Michael asked to make a statement. The judge granted his request, and for the first time since his arrest, Catherine saw a crack in her brother's composed facade. "I did it," Michael said simply, looking not at the jury but at Catherine. "I poisoned our mother. I arranged for her to be buried alive, and I would do it again." A gasp went through the courtroom. The defense attorney tried to interrupt, but Michael continued, his voice rising. "You all think she was a saint. The great Eleanor Blackwood, pillar of the community, savior of orphaned children. You didn't know what she really was, what she did." "Mr. Blackwood," the judge warned, "this is not the time for—" "She knew what I was from the beginning," Michael went on, ignoring the judge. "She knew, and she protected me, until it became inconvenient. Until Alexandra. One girl goes missing and suddenly mother develops a conscience. Suddenly I'm the monster who needs to be sent away." Catherine felt sick. So it was true. He had killed Alexandra all those years ago, and perhaps others before her. "Your Honor, my client is clearly not in his right mind," the defense attorney said desperately. "I request a recess." But it was too late. Michael had confessed in open court, confirmed the most damning suspicions against him. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Michael was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, he looked back at Catherine one last time. "She got what she deserved," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And so did I." Those were the last words Catherine ever heard from her brother. She didn't visit him in prison, didn't respond to his letters. Some ties, once broken, couldn't be mended, nor should they be. A year after Eleanor's death, Catherine stood at her mother's grave, placing fresh flowers beside the simple headstone. The inscription read, "Eleanor Blackwood, 1946 to 2024, her works live on." "I've been thinking about what you would say if you were here," Catherine said softly to the grave. "About forgiveness, probably. You always believed in second chances. But Eleanor had also believed in justice. She had meticulously gathered evidence against her own son, knowing what it would mean for him if it ever came to light. She had chosen truth over family loyalty in the end. As Catherine turned to leave, she noticed Frank Porter, the cemetery caretaker, watching her from a respectful distance. She walked over to him. "How are you, Frank?" she asked. He nodded, leaning on his rake. "Well enough, Ms. Blackwood. Just wanted to tell you, those whispers people heard last year, they've stopped. The mausoleum's quiet now. Has been ever since?" "Since justice was done," Catherine finished for him. "Yes, ma'am. Exactly that." Catherine looked back at her mother's grave, peaceful under the dappled shade of the maple tree. The truth had not stayed buried. It had found its way out, just as Eleanor had planned, speaking from beyond the grave through journal pages, digital, recordings, and perhaps even those ghostly whispers that had first led Catherine to discover what had really happened. Some people in town still claimed to hear sounds from the old Blackwood mausoleum on quiet nights. Not the desperate whispers of before, but a gentle, peaceful sigh, as if someone long trapped had finally found release. Catherine didn't know if she believed in such things, but she found comfort in the thought nonetheless. "Goodbye, Mom," she said softly, and walked back toward town, toward the children's home where Eleanor's legacy continued, toward a future built on truth rather than secrets. Behind her, a gentle breeze stirred the maple leaves, sending dappled sunlight dancing across Eleanor Blackwood's final resting place. A whisper of wind that seemed, just for a moment, to form words. Peace. At last.